What exists today as South Africa is not a natural evolution of a single people. It is the product of 3 centuries of colliding empires, settler expansion, and the construction of the most rigid racial hierarchy the modern world has ever seen. To understand South Africa today, you have to look past the borders and see the design. You have to see how a refueling station for ships became a laboratory for human engineering. This is the story of how South Africa came to be. Before the first European sail appeared on the horizon, the southern tip of Africa was anything but empty. It was a complex mosaic of civilizations. In the west, the Khoisan people, the world's oldest genetic lineage, lived as hunter-gatherers and skilled pastoralists managing vast herds of cattle. To the east and north, Bantu-speaking societies like the Xhosa, Zulu, and Sotho had built sophisticated Iron Age kingdoms. These weren't just tribes, they were organized states with intricate land tenure systems, deep trade networks that reached as far as East Africa, and specialized political hierarchies. There was no South Africa. There were many Africas. But in 1652, the logic of global trade arrived to rewrite the map. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, didn't land at the Cape to build a country. They landed to build a grocery store. The Cape was halfway between Europe and the spice riches of the East Indies. Ships were losing a third of their crews to scurvy. They needed fresh meat and vegetables. Jan van Riebeek, the company's commander, was ordered to build a fort and a garden. Nothing more. But trade stations have a habit of growing roots. To feed the ships, the Dutch needed farms. To run the farms, they needed land. And when the Khoisan refused to become laborers for the company, the Dutch brought in a new solution: slavery. Between 1653 and 1807, over 60,000 people were trafficked into the Cape from Madagascar, India, and the East Indies. This created a unique, high-friction society where land ownership was racialized from the very first harvest. The Dutch settlers, the Boers, began to push deeper into the interior, seeing themselves not as company employees, but as a chosen people, destined to tame a wilderness that was already inhabited. In 1806, during the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain seized the Cape. They didn't care about the farms, they cared about the geography. Whoever controlled the Cape controlled the jugular of global trade. The British brought a new operating system, English law, a free press, and eventually the 1833 abolition of slavery. To the Boer settlers, this was an existential threat. They didn't just lose their enslaved labor, they lost their status. In the 1830s, thousands of Boers packed their wagons and headed north in what is known as the Great Trek. They were looking for independence, but their path led them directly into the heart of the most powerful military machine in Africa, the Zulu Kingdom. Under King Shaka, the Zulu had revolutionized warfare with the unequal short sword and the buffalo horns formation. The mid-1800s were defined by a 3-way struggle for the interior: British administrators, Boer republics like the Transvaal, and African kingdoms fighting for their sovereignty. For 2 centuries, South Africa was a land of slow-moving wagons and cattle. Then, in 1867, a child found a shiny pebble on the banks of the Orange River. It was a diamond. In 1886, an even bigger discovery followed: the main reef of gold in the Witwatersrand. Everything changed overnight. Johannesburg went from a dusty camp to a city of gold. But gold in South Africa is low grade. It is buried miles deep in hard rock. Mining it required 2 things: massive amounts of British capital and massive amounts of cheap, controlled labor. This is the moment the modern South African state was truly designed. It wasn't just racism, it was industrial economics. To keep labor costs low, the British and the mining magnates like Cecil Rhodes developed a system of migrant labor. African men were forced into compounds, separated from their families, and forced to carry passbooks to track their every movement. In 1913, the Natives Land Act was passed, restricting black Africans, who made up nearly 80% of the population, to just 7% of the land. The goal was simple: make it impossible for black people to survive on their own farms, so they would be forced to work in the white-owned mines. The British wanted the gold. The Boers owned the land it was under. The result was the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1899. It was a total war. The British, frustrated by Boer guerrilla tactics, burned 30,000 farms and moved Boer women and children into concentration camps, where 26,000 died from disease and neglect. The British won the war, but they realized they couldn't rule without the Boers. In 1910, they formed the Union of South Africa, a marriage of convenience between British capital and Boer political power. This new state was built on a foundation of exclusion. It was a white-ruled union that stripped black people of the few voting rights they had. In 1948, this system was perfected when the National Party came to power and introduced apartheid. They didn't invent segregation, they codified it into a pseudoscience. They divided the population into 4 rigid categories: white, black, colored, and Indian. Under the Group Areas Act, the state forcibly removed over 3.5 million people from their homes to create white-only cities. But you cannot design a state that ignores 80% of its people without expecting a collapse. Resistance was constant. From the 1960 Sharpeville Massacre to the 1976 Soweto Uprising, the state used imprisonment, bans, and state-sponsored violence to maintain control. By the 1980s, the system was failing. International sanctions, internal strikes, and the sheer cost of maintaining a police state made apartheid unsustainable. In 1994, after decades of struggle and the release of Nelson Mandela, South Africa held its first democratic election. But as the celebrations ended, the reality of the design remained. The colonial era hadn't just taken land, it had designed the schools, the hospitals, the suburbs, and the economy to serve a minority. South Africa today is often called a post-apartheid state, but it is more accurately a post-colonial one. The borders, the mineral-heavy economy, and the extreme inequality are the ghosts of a system built for extraction and control. History shows us that a state is more than just people living together, it is an architecture. Understanding that architecture is the first step toward building something new. If this breakdown helped you see the gears of history turning, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Tell me in the comments, can a state built for exclusion ever truly be redesigned for equality? Until next time, keep questioning history.